In the quiet hills of Kentucky, where mist settles over endless tobacco fields, the Parrish family's name was ordinary, unremarkable. Yet something happened behind the closed doors of their farmhouse in 1951 that would remain buried for decades. A secret that twisted the line between life and something far stranger. A photograph, now lost to time, shows two infants with eyes that seem to pierce the soul, fingers that bend unnaturally, and expressions that chill the air. Their parents, once devoted and conventional, vanished into a web of silence, guarding children who were no longer quite human. Rumors whispered through the county, but no one dared speak openly. Tonight, you will hear a story that blends family loyalty, fear, and the unexplainable. One that asks if some bloodlines carry a darkness we are not meant to understand. Disclaimer: this story is pure fiction. Any resemblance to real people, events, or places is coincidental. Chapter 1. The Photograph That Shouldn't Exist. On a cold winter evening of 1951, a photograph was taken in a farmhouse in Carter County, Kentucky, that would haunt anyone who ever glimpsed it. It showed two infants lying side by side in a wooden crib, twins Thomas and Sarah Parrish. But their features were wrong. Their eyes were unnervingly wide apart, their fingers stiff and oddly jointed. Even their expressions, frozen in that single frame, suggested they saw something unseen. The Parrish family had lived on the same 200 acres for generations, farming tobacco and attending the small Baptist church on Route 19. Their lives were quiet, ordinary, predictable. Yet behind the walls of that farmhouse, something extraordinary and terrifying was taking shape. Margaret Parrish had delivered her twins to full term, without complication, but the moment she held them, the air in the room thickened with unease. Ethel Combes, the midwife, a woman seasoned by decades of childbirth, almost fled the house. Her hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from her brow, but something, duty, fear, or curiosity, kept her in place. She had delivered hundreds of babies, but these children did not obey the rules of anatomy. Thomas's spine curved in unnatural ways, legs mismatched by almost a foot. Sarah's skull was soft in places it shouldn't be, her translucent skin revealing a strange pulse beneath. Dr. Howard Brennan arrived the next morning. He examined the twins in silence, a rare unease creeping across his professional composure. When asked if they would survive, he looked out at the fog rolling over the fields and said words that would echo in the family's memory forever. Survival isn't really the question we should be asking. That day, a choice was made. The twins would remain in the family home, hidden from neighbors, researchers, and the church. Publicly, Thomas and Sarah ceased to exist. Two empty caskets were buried in the Baptist churchyard, a small, somber gesture to the world outside. Behind closed doors, Margaret and her husband Robert became guardians of an extraordinary secret. The farmhouse transformed into a fortress, windows curtained even in daylight. The doors opened only for necessity. The community noticed their retreat, but understood grief. What they could not guess was that something unnatural was growing within, something that would challenge the very definition of family, humanity, and fear. Next, we discover how the twins' early growth defied all logic and began to hint at the unsettling powers they might possess. Chapter 2. A Normal Family. No longer. The Parrish farmhouse had grown silent in a way that made the walls themselves seem heavy. Outside, the mist rolled across the tobacco fields of Carter County, but inside, Margaret Parrish's life had narrowed to a single focus: the twins. Thomas and Sarah were alive, breathing, and yet not entirely human. By their second birthday, the twins exhibited movements that defied reason. Thomas could pull himself across the floor, dragging legs that refused to obey his body properly. Sarah could prop herself against pillows, sitting upright for minutes at a time, but her gaze held something beyond childish curiosity, an almost preternatural awareness. They recognized voices, light and touch, but often it seemed they were listening to, or seeing, something the rest of the world could not. Margaret kept a journal, hidden beneath the floorboards, where she documented every anomaly. She wrote of the nights when Thomas and Sarah would awaken without sound, eyes reflecting shadows on the ceiling, communicating in gestures and subtle glances that she could not interpret. At times, it seemed as though the twins shared a private world, one that had no words, yet spoke volumes. Robert Parish struggled to reconcile the children he held with the ones he had imagined. Nights were long and restless, the house echoing with soft, unearthly sounds, a giggle that sounded like the scraping of fingernails on wood, a whisper that did not carry meaning, but stirred unease. Neighbors occasionally knocked, bearing casseroles or condolences, but Robert's polite refusals were firm. The world outside the farmhouse was not for Thomas and Sarah. Even Ethel Commies, the midwife, who had once feared for her own sanity at the sight of them, admitted privately to her daughter that the Parish twins were unlike anything she had ever seen. The town whispered of strange leer, geats seen through curtained windows at odd hours, shadows moving against the walls where no one stood, and the faintest sounds of laughter when no children were in sight. Yet the Parishes maintained the illusion of normal grief, 2 empty graves, 2 names erased from memory. Margaret often sat by the crib, holding one twin while observing the other. She noticed patterns. Their heads would tilt towards sounds she couldn't hear, their eyes would track movements that had no source. On some nights, she swore the twins were speaking silently, their faces contorted in expression, as if holding secrets too vast to articulate. And she began to fear that what was growing in her home was not simply strange, it was something unstoppable. The community never suspected. In 1950s rural Kentucky, privacy was respected and grief excused silence. But within the Parish farmhouse, time was folding in on itself. The children were growing, learning, adapting, and the world they were growing into was not the one anyone outside could understand. Next, we discover the first signs that Thomas and Sarah's growth is more than physical. Strange abilities begin to manifest, and Margaret realizes the twins are changing in ways that will challenge everything she believes about life itself. Chapter 3. The First Signs. By the summer of 1954, the Parish farmhouse had become a world apart. The sun streamed over the fields, but inside, shadows lingered longer than they should. Thomas and Sarah, now 3 years old, were no longer simply strange. They were becoming something otherworldly. Margaret first noticed it one sweltering afternoon while hanging laundry in the backyard. Thomas had crawled to the edge of the porch and reached out, almost as if he were sensing something invisible. Then, without touching anything, the clothes on the line twitched. A soft rustle, almost playful and yet deliberate. Margaret froze, heart hammering, and watched as Sarah, perched near the open window, mirrored the same motions. The hair on her arms lifted, eyes locked on nothing, yet she smiled. At night, whispers filled the corners of the house. Not words exactly, more like vibrations, tones that resonated deep in the bones. Margaret and Robert would sometimes find objects shifted in impossible ways. A chair tilted toward the twins, a book opened to a page neither had touched, small puddles of water appearing on the floor from nowhere. The children themselves seemed oblivious, laughing or babbling, their faces lit with an eerie, unplaceable joy. Margaret's journal grew more urgent. She wrote of their unerring intuition, the way they anticipated events before they happened. Once, a neighbor's horse broke free from its stall. Before anyone else could react, Thomas crawled to the barn and stopped it with nothing but a small, insistent gesture. No one saw the child reach out, yet the horse obeyed, frozen as if bound by invisible reins. Robert dismissed some incidents as coincidence or parental imagination, but even he could not ignore the pattern. The twins were connected to something larger than themselves, an unseen current of energy or awareness that pulsed through the farmhouse. The air seemed thicker near them, alive, heavy with anticipation. Margaret began to dread what others might think if they ever saw it. But the thought of letting anyone near her children filled her with a greater fear. By now, the house felt alive. The twins' presence reshaped it, bending space and perception in subtle ways. Sounds were muffled or amplified depending on where the children sat. Light slanted oddly across the floors, shadows stretching too far or vanishing entirely. Even the cats and chickens, normally skittish, behaved differently, drawn to the children yet wary, as if sensing the unknown. Margaret often caught herself staring at them, unable to reconcile their ordinary faces with the power that seemed to radiate from their small bodies. The twins were growing fast, but not just in size. They were growing into something that defied every rule she had ever known. Next, we discover the first terrifying incident outside the safety of the house. Neighbors begin to glimpse the twins' abilities, and the quiet paranoia of Carter County turns towards suspicion, fear, and whispers of the unnatural. Chapter 4. Whispers in Carter County. By the spring of 1955, the quiet of Carter County was beginning to shift. The parish farmhouse, long respected as a place of private grief, had begun to attract subtle attention. Not because anyone knew the full story, but because whispers traveled faster than the morning fog over the tobacco fields. Neighbors started noticing oddities, lights flickering behind curtained windows when no one was inside. Unusual sounds drifting through the night, the faint echo of children's laughter when no children were reported. Chickens and barn animals behaving strangely, clustering near the edges of the yard, watching with tense alertness. Folks would shrug it off, blaming superstition, exhaustion, or simple rural imagination. Yet the parish family's quiet, methodical life had already begun to seem unnatural. One afternoon, a local delivery man, Mr. Harlan, came to drop off a crate of farm supplies. As he stepped onto the porch, he noticed the twins peering from a window. Their eyes, so human yet impossibly still, locked onto him. Harlan froze. The air around the house felt heavier, charged. He blinked, and the twins were gone, as if the shadows themselves had swallowed them. He walked away quickly, claiming he had mistaken a reflection. Yet that night he told his wife, shaking, that something lived in that house that didn't belong here. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret and Robert grew increasingly vigilant. The twins were developing faster than ever, not just in size but in awareness. Sarah had begun producing patterns of sound, strange, lilting tones that Thomas seemed to respond to instinctively. Margaret recorded in her journal that the children's communication was no longer human speech, yet it was profoundly intelligent. They seemed to share knowledge silently, anticipating each other's movements with impossible precision. The families. Isolation became even more deliberate. Windows drawn tight, doors bolted, and trips outside minimized. Robert would go to the fields early, staying long enough to tend the tobacco, but never lingering. Margaret rarely left the house, confined to a small radius around the twins. Visitors were refused politely but firmly. The outside world was no longer safe for the children, or perhaps the world itself was not meant to exist around them. And then came the first truly alarming incident. Mrs. Eddington, an elderly neighbour, came to collect eggs from the parish coop, a task she had performed weekly for years. When she leaned over to reach for a basket, she felt an unseen force push her back. The basket toppled, eggs shattering. Terrified, she fled, mumbling about the devil children, her face pale as the morning mist. Rumours began to swirl, soft whispers in church pews, sideways glances during Sunday dinners, questions asked only in hushed tones. The parishes had hoped secrecy could shield the twins, but now the first cracks in that fragile wall of silence were forming. The children's abilities could no longer be contained to the house alone. They were beginning to echo into the world outside. Next, we discover the terrifying night when the twins' powers manifest fully for the first time, leaving the family and an unsuspecting neighbour forever changed. Chapter 5. The Night of Shadows. It was a moonless night in June of 1955 when the parishes first realized the full extent of Thomas and Sarah's abilities. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick with summer heat, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the darkness outside. Margaret lay awake in her bed, listening to the twins' soft murmurs from the nursery, a feeling of unease creeping over her. Something was different tonight, heavier, sharper, almost predatory. Suddenly, a crash echoed from the back of the house. Margaret bolted upright. Robert, already on edge from the recent neighbour incidents, grabbed a lantern and rushed toward the source. What they saw froze them in place. The heavy wooden door to the barn, which had been latched securely, was swinging open on its own. Shadows flickered unnaturally against the walls, though no wind had entered the closed house. The twins were in the center of the barn. Thomas's legs dragged beneath him as he hovered above the dirt floor, eyes locked on the animals clustered near the far wall. Sarah's small hands moved in intricate patterns, and the chickens and goats froze mid-step, as if held in invisible grasp. Margaret felt a chill run through her spine. This was no longer simple intuition or subtle influence. Something powerful and deliberate was taking place. As the moment stretched, the twins' whispers became louder, an almost musical hum vibrating through the barn. Robert's lantern flickered violently, then dimmed to a dull glow. Objects, buckets, tools, even the edge of the barn door began to move without contact, drawn toward the twins. Margaret called out, but her voice seemed to vanish in the charged air. It was as if the house itself had been absorbed into their presence. Suddenly, the back wall of the barn seemed to bend, warping slightly, as though reality itself resisted their influence. Margaret screamed, rushing forward. But Thomas reached out, not violently, but with an undeniable force, and the floor beneath her feet shivered. The animals scattered, yet none of them touched the twins. Sarah's eyes, wide and unblinking, glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting an intelligence that no human could comprehend. When the spectacle finally ended, everything returned to normal, or what passed for normal. The barn door rested closed, animals moved naturally, and the humid summer night carried only the usual sounds of crickets and distant frogs. Margaret sank to the ground, trembling. Robert, pale and speechless, finally whispered, "There's something else." From that night on, there was no denying it. The twins were no longer simply children hidden behind grief and secrecy. They were something entirely beyond comprehension, capable of manipulating the world in ways that defied every law Margaret and Robert had known. The following day, whispers from the neighboring farms grew louder, fueled by odd lights seen through the parish windows and unexplained noises in the night. The fragile barrier of secrecy they had maintained for years was beginning to crumble, and the outside world would soon bear witness to the truth, or at least a shadow of it. Next, we discover the first confrontation with a neighbor who witnesses the twins' abilities firsthand, pushing the parish family to the edge of panic and secrecy.
Chapter 6. The First Witness. It was a warm July afternoon when the fragile silence of Carter County began to fracture. Mr. Harlan, the delivery man who had once glimpsed the twins through the curtained window, returned, not by choice, but necessity. He had been tasked with dropping off a new shipment of farming supplies. The parishes had warned him before, no unnecessary visits, no lingering, but the hot sun and the weight of duty had drawn him back. As he stepped onto the porch, Thomas and Sarah were waiting, their small forms pressed to the window pane. Their eyes, wide and unnervingly still, followed his every movement. Mr. Harlan froze mid-step. The air felt thicker here, heavier, charged with a presence that made his skin crawl. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the sense of being watched by something that could see into his very thoughts. Suddenly, a crate of supplies tipped over on its own. Wood splintered softly, and tools clattered across the porch. Mr. Harlan's knees nearly buckled, but he held the edge of the railing, trying to rationalize what he saw. "Breeze," he muttered. But the air was still, the twins' small hands pressed to the glass, and with a movement no larger than a blink, the crate righted itself. The delivery man's eyes widened. He whispered a prayer under his breath, but even that seemed futile against the quiet intelligence in the children's gaze. Margaret emerged from the doorway, calm but taut, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured him inside. "Nothing for you to see," she said softly. "Just drop the supplies." But Mr. Harlan's mind raced. What he had just witnessed could not be ignored, and the story followed him home that evening. At the Baptist church the next Sunday, his whispered words spread quietly. "The parish twins. Something's wrong there. Something not right." Mothers clutched their children a little closer. Men exchanged uneasy glances. Fear, subtle but insidious, had begun to creep through the county. Back at the farmhouse, Margaret and Robert sat silently in the dimly lit kitchen. They had been careful for years, curtains drawn, no visitors, empty graves to mask reality, but now the first real threat to their secrecy had arrived. The knowledge that someone outside the family had seen Thomas and Sarah's abilities brought with it a gnawing panic. What if others came? What if their world, so carefully protected, was torn apart? That night, Margaret wrote feverishly in her hidden journal. Every twitch of the twins, every whispered tone, every inexplicable movement was recorded. She noted the increasing precision of their abilities, the way they seemed to anticipate events, and the quiet menace that accompanied their innocence. Even she, who had nurtured them since birth, felt a creeping sense of unease. They were still children, yet their power carried the weight of something ancient, something that did not belong to the ordinary world. Robert, once skeptical, now stared at his sleeping twins with a mixture of awe and dread. He whispered under his breath, "We've unleashed something we don't understand, and the world is beginning to notice." Next, we discover how the growing curiosity and fear of Carter County begins to collide with the twins' world, forcing the parishes into desperate measures to protect their secret. Chapter 7. The Rising Fear. By the summer of 1955, the quiet of Carter County was no longer so quiet. Whispers of the parish twins had begun to ripple outward, carried in cautious murmurs from church pews and farm fences. No one spoke openly of what they suspected, but everyone noticed the subtle, inexplicable oddities surrounding the farmhouse. Lights that flickered without wind, shadows that twisted unnaturally, and animals that shied away from the house as if sensing something unseen. Margaret and Robert felt the weight of each passing day pressing harder against their fragile secrecy. They had hoped Mr. Harlan's initial shock would remain private, yet rumors spread faster than the mist that clung to the hills. On several occasions, neighbors lingered near the edges of the property, claiming to glimpse the twins moving in ways that defied logic. Some swore they heard laughter when no children were present, whispers that carried through the night air like distant music. The twins themselves remained innocent in appearance, yet their abilities were growing more precise, more deliberate. Thomas could now manipulate objects at a distance with frightening accuracy. A chair would topple subtly if it obstructed his path. A glass of water would tremble as if acknowledging his attention. Sarah's eyes, unblinking and wide, followed patterns invisible to human perception, anticipating movements before they happened. Together, they seemed to operate as one entity, communicating silently through gestures, tones and glances that Margaret could barely comprehend. One evening, a neighbor's dog ran loose near the edge of the parish property. It froze mid-step, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the twins standing at the window. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway, breath held as the animal slowly backed away, retreating to its owner without a single command. Robert's hands were clenched tightly on the countertop. "It's only going to get worse if people start noticing more," he muttered, the first real trace of panic in his voice. As the tension in the community mounted, the parishes took increasingly extreme precautions. Windows were covered even in daylight, doors bolted and trips outside limited. Margaret began to wonder if they had been too cautious, if the children's growing powers could be contained at all. At night she would listen for the subtle hum of the twins communicating, the faint vibration of objects moving without touch, and the small, unplaceable sounds that seemed to echo through the walls. Carter County was on the verge of suspicion, though few could articulate it. The twins remained hidden from view, yet their presence was impossible to ignore, and as their abilities strengthened, so too did the invisible thread of fear that tied the community to the farmhouse. Margaret realized with a shiver that secrecy alone might no longer be enough. Next we discover the first real breach, the night a neighbor inadvertently witnesses Thomas and Sarah's powers in a way that terrifies him, forcing the parish family into desperate action to protect their secret. Chapter 8. The Unseen Witness. The parish farmhouse had always been a fortress, its walls thick with secrecy. Yet in August of 1955, the carefully constructed barrier of silence began to crack. Mr. Harlan, the delivery man who had glimpsed the twins before, returned late one evening, carrying a package for Robert. He had ignored the warnings of his own instincts, and now he was about to see more than he could ever explain. As he stepped onto the porch, the air around him seemed to shift. It was heavier, almost viscous, pressing against his chest as though the house itself were alive. Through the window he saw Thomas and Sarah. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, unblinking, locked on him. Harlan froze mid-step, a chill crawling up his spine. He could feel the twins' attention as though it were a physical weight, invisible hands pressing on his mind. Suddenly, a crate he had been carrying lifted slightly off the floor, tilting as if caught in an unseen force. The package dropped with a soft thud, yet Harlan could not move. The twins' hands pressed to the glass, their small fingers splayed, and a subtle vibration hummed through the porch. He realized with mounting terror that they were aware of him, not just observing but communicating silently in a language he could not understand. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret watched from the doorway. Her heart pounded as she assessed the situation. The twins were not malicious, but their curiosity and awareness were growing too strong. Harlan could not know the full truth. If he did, the fragile secrecy that had protected the family for years could be shattered in an instant. She whispered to Robert, "We have to distract him. Now." With a soft command, barely audible even to herself, Margaret reached for the twins' attention. They responded instantly, looking away from Harlan, their tiny heads tilting as if acknowledging her presence. The spell, or the weight, on him lifted. Harlan stumbled back, shaking his head, unaware of what had occurred. He muttered a nervous apology and retreated to the edge of the property, eyes darting to the house with unspoken fear. That night, Margaret wrote in her hidden journal with trembling hands. The twins' abilities were no longer confined to the house. They could reach into the world outside, altering objects and perceptions without touch. Robert sat silently, staring at the twins' sleeping forms, a knot of dread in his stomach. "How long can we hide this?" he asked softly. "How long before someone else sees what we saw tonight?" Even as the night settled over Carter County, the invisible threads of fear and curiosity were stretching. The twins' presence could no longer remain hidden entirely, and the parishes knew that sooner or later the outside world would collide with the extraordinary reality they had been protecting. Next, we discover the first public incident, a moment when the twins' powers make themselves undeniably known, shaking the community's sense of reality and pushing the parish family to the edge of panic. Chapter 9. The First Public Incident. The evening air was thick with the scent of tobacco and the fading warmth of the sun when the parish twins' secret finally slipped into the wider world. A traveling salesman, Mr. Collins, had been passing through Carter County, delivering wares to local families. He arrived at the parish farmhouse, unaware of the peculiar reputation that now clung to the property like a shadow. As he stepped onto the porch, the twins appeared at the window, small silhouettes against the dim light. Thomas and Sarah, now 4 years old, were no longer merely observers. Their eyes glimmered with the subtle intensity of something beyond comprehension. Mr. Collins smiled politely, assuming curiosity, but within moments his demeanor shifted to unease. Objects on the porch, a stack of crates, a tin bucket, even his own leather satchel, began to tremble and move slightly, as if guided by invisible hands. Margaret appeared, calm yet tense, her voice a quiet command. "Please, sir, just drop the package and step back." But the twins had already noticed the man's internal hesitation. The air vibrated faintly, and a breeze that should not exist rippled across the porch. Mr. Collins stepped back involuntarily, tripping over the threshold. He fell against the edge of the railing, eyes wide, staring at the twins in horror. The household animals, the barn cat, the chickens, froze mid-step, watching the twins as though awaiting orders. The air seemed to hum with energy, and Mr. Collins could no longer explain what he was seeing. Fear gripped him in a physical way. His heart raced, his breaths came short and sharp. He felt a strange, compelling force guiding him backward toward the edge of the property. Margaret watched, praying that the twins would not push too far. She knew even the slightest lapse in control could reveal too much. Finally, the movement ceased. The twins stepped away from the window, giggling softly, as though the tension itself had amused them. Mr. Collins scrambled to his feet, muttering incoherently, clutching his satchel. He didn't need an invitation. He fled down the path toward the county road, glancing over his shoulder as though the shadows themselves were pursuing him. Later that night, Margaret and Robert sat in silence, their minds heavy with dread. The twins' abilities were no longer a secret contained within the walls of their home. They had reached beyond, touching the minds and perceptions of outsiders. Margaret penned another entry in her hidden journal, noting the precision and subtlety with which Thomas and Sarah exerted influence. "They are aware of everything," she wrote. "We cannot protect them forever." The following morning, whispers reached the church, and the rumor mill of Carter County churned faster than ever. A traveling salesman who claimed to have witnessed strange happenings at the parish farm. It was enough to stir curiosity, fear, and superstition among the locals. Eyes turned toward the farmhouse, and a tension hung in the air that could be felt but not named. Next, we discover how the twins begin to test the boundaries of their power, revealing glimpses of abilities far beyond manipulation of objects, abilities that will challenge both the parish's control and the sanity of anyone who witnesses them.
Did you know, in 1957 in Hexham, England, a striking case involving twins was documented by researchers and has puzzled historians and paranormal enthusiasts for decades. A family lost two daughters, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock, in a tragic accident. 13 months later, the mother gave birth to twin girls, Gillian and Jennifer, even though the couple had no history of twins in their family. What made this case unusual was that the younger of the twins appeared to show striking birthmarks and behavioral patterns that seemed to correspond to her deceased sister's scars and fears, particularly an unexplained fear of cars. Some researchers and explorers of anomalous phenomena have suggested this could be an example of reincarnation or deep psychological imprinting, while skeptics attribute it to coincidence or selective memory. Scientists and historians still debate the interpretation, but the case remains one of the most documented and talked about twin mysteries in 20th century history. Why this matters? It's one of the rare modern documented cases where twins and birth patterns captured widespread attention, making it perfect real-world context for your fictional story.
Chapter 10. Testing the Limits. By late 1955, the parishes understood that Thomas and Sarah were no ordinary children. Their abilities had grown beyond moving objects or bending animals to their will. The twins began testing boundaries, often in ways that terrified even Margaret and Robert. What had once been subtle influence was now unmistakable and undeniable. One evening, as Margaret prepared dinner, she noticed a stack of plates trembling on the counter. At first, she thought it was the draft from the open window, but the air was still. The trembling grew, and the plates began to slide across the countertop toward the twins, who were sitting at the kitchen table, their small hands hovering over them as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen them exert such precise control. Thomas's gaze lifted, unblinking, focused on the knife block. The knives lifted slowly into the air, spinning lightly, suspended without any visible support. Sarah clapped her hands once, and the knives dropped harmlessly onto a folded towel. Margaret realized with a cold shock that the twins understood danger, and yet they toyed with it for their own amusement. Outside, Robert tended to the tobacco fields, but even there he sensed their influence. A sudden gust of wind swept over the plants, flattening rows in unnatural patterns. Margaret later found evidence that the twins had caused it. The stalks bent in intricate designs, almost like a message written in the land itself. The subtlety of their power was astounding, precision that no adult could achieve, yet playful, childlike in intent. Neighbors began whispering more openly now. Some claimed to see shadows that moved independently of the children, lights that flickered in empty rooms, and doors that opened or closed without human touch. The parishes remained careful, yet they realized the twins' abilities could not be contained indefinitely. With every passing day, their world expanded, and so did the risk of exposure. Margaret's journal entries became frantic. She noted patterns in the twins' actions, how they communicated silently, how they influenced the world without touching it, and how they seemed to sense the emotions of everyone around them. She wrote of an intuitive intelligence that was impossible to measure, a presence that suggested the children were far older, far wiser, and far more powerful than their physical forms suggested. One night, as the family sat quietly by the fireplace, the twins stood together in the center of the room, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. Objects lifted, swirled, and returned to their places. Margaret whispered, "They're learning control. Too fast." Robert nodded, pale, gripping the arm of his chair. There was awe, yes, but beneath it, an inescapable fear. Next, we discover the first confrontation with someone who refuses to ignore the strange happenings. The day an outsider decides to uncover the truth about Thomas and Sarah, forcing the Parrish family into a desperate choice that will test everything they have protected.
Chapter 11. The Intruder. By the winter of 1955, Carter County's whispers had grown louder, fueled by stories of strange happenings at the Parrish farmhouse. The secrecy that Margaret and Robert had so carefully maintained was beginning to unravel. People were curious, and curiosity in small towns quickly turned to action. One chilly December afternoon, a man named Mr. Whitaker, a self-proclaimed investigator of oddities, arrived unannounced at the Parrish property. He was not a neighbor, not a salesman, but a curious outsider with an insistent gaze and an unyielding determination. He had heard the rumors: children with unnatural powers, lights moving without reason, shadows behaving as if alive. He wanted proof. Margaret's first instinct was to refuse him entry, to reinforce the boundaries that had protected the family for years. But Whitaker was relentless. He circled the property, peering through windows, noting every detail of the farmhouse. Margaret watched from behind the curtains, heart racing, as Thomas and Sarah observed the stranger too. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, followed his every movement. Even sitting quietly, their presence seemed to weigh down the air around him. Inside, the twins began to test boundaries more aggressively than ever. Objects on the porch twitched and moved subtly as Whitaker approached. A gust of wind slammed a door shut behind him, though the air was still. His notebook toppled, papers fluttering into the mud as if pushed by invisible hands. Margaret could see the fear growing in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he tried to maintain composure. Robert confronted him firmly. "You need to leave. Now." Whitaker ignored the warning, jotting frantic notes and speaking softly into a small recorder. He had come for answers, and he would not leave without them. The twins, sensing the tension, stepped closer to the window. His fingers twitched subtly, almost like a conductor orchestrating a symphony. Thomas's gaze fixed on Whitaker with an intensity that made the man stumble backward. Objects lifted, swirled, and fell harmlessly around him. He dropped to his knees, eyes wide in terror, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. Margaret whispered to Robert, her voice tense, "We've lost control, or he's forced them to show it." The twins were learning, adapting, responding not only to commands but to threats and curiosity alike. Whitaker's persistence had pulled them out of their private world, and there was no way to predict what they might do next. That night, as the snow fell softly across the fields, the family gathered silently. Margaret's journal lay open, filled with frantic notes. The boundary between secrecy and exposure had been crossed. The twins had revealed more than anyone outside should have ever known, and the fragile calm of the Parrish household teetered on the brink of chaos. Next, we discover how the twins react to direct confrontation, unleashing a display of power that terrifies even the most skeptical observer and forces the Parrishes to reconsider the lengths they must go to protect their secret. Chapter 12. Unleashed. The night air in Carter County carried a biting chill, but inside the Parrish farmhouse, the tension was far colder. Mr. Whitaker, the relentless investigator, had returned the following evening, determined to witness the truth for himself. He did not expect what was waiting for him. Thomas and Sarah were seated side by side in the nursery, their small bodies still, yet their presence filled the room like a living force. Margaret and Robert watched from the doorway, hearts pounding, as the twins' awareness extended beyond their physical forms. The moment Whitaker stepped into the hallway, the air seemed to thrum with energy, pressing against him in a way that made every step heavy. Whitaker advanced cautiously, notebook and recorder in hand, eyes darting to the nursery window. He saw the twins raise their heads slowly, unblinking, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Objects near the doorway, chairs, books, even a small lamp, lifted subtly, then hovered, as though suspended by invisible threads. Whitaker stumbled, breath catching, and muttered under his breath, This isn't possible." The twins' communication was no longer subtle. They began to orchestrate a display of power that seemed almost choreographed. Thomas's small hand gestured, and the lamp swirled in the air like a top. Sarah clapped her hands softly, and the books opened and flipped pages on their own. Margaret's stomach churned with fear. She had never seen them exercise such control, such deliberate intent. Whitaker, though terrified, refused to flee. He raised the recorder toward the twins, trying to document the phenomenon. That was when the room itself seemed to bend. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, light flickered violently, and the floor vibrated beneath their feet. Whitaker fell to his knees, eyes wide, unable to comprehend the force that held him in place. Margaret whispered, "Stop!" but the twins only tilted their heads, as if considering her words. Thomas reached toward Whitaker, not with malice, but with a curiosity that mirrored the man's own persistent intrusion. The investigator's hands trembled as he struggled to rise, only to find that the objects around him, books, chairs, even the edge of the doorway, responded instantly to the twins' attention. Finally, with a subtle gesture from Sarah, the room calmed. Objects settled, the shadows receded, and the heavy presence lifted. Whitaker scrambled backward, pale and shaken, whispering, I can't explain this." He fled into the night, leaving the parishes in silence. Margaret sank to the floor, exhausted, her hands trembling as she took the twins into her arms. "They're learning too fast," she whispered. Robert nodded silently. Fear and awe etched deeply on his face. The children had demonstrated not only awareness, but full control of the extraordinary force that had always lurked just beneath their human facade. Next, we discover the aftermath of Whitaker's encounter. The fear spreading through Carter County, the rumors igniting, and the parishes forced to make choices that will determine the future of Thomas and Sarah. Chapter 13. Ripples of Fear. The morning after Whitaker's encounter, the parishes awoke to a tension that could be felt in every corner of Carter County. Word had traveled faster than the winter winds. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, whispers had already begun circulating at the Baptist church, along dirt roads, and in the general store. Something was happening at the parish farmhouse, something that could not be explained. Margaret and Robert sat at the kitchen table, silent, drinking tea as they listened to the subtle, unplaceable hum that always lingered near the twins. Their children played quietly in the nursery, but Margaret could feel the awareness radiating off them like invisible ripples. The display last night had been necessary to protect their secret, but it had left the county unsettled, curious, and increasingly suspicious. By mid-morning, neighbors began to appear at the edge of the property, ostensibly to check on the family, but their eyes were sharp, probing, searching for evidence. Mr. Harlan returned, his face pale and tight, shaking as he described the unnatural events he had witnessed. Rumors ignited like sparks across dry grass. "The twins aren't normal," people said in hushed tones. "They can move things without touching them. They're not right." Margaret gripped Robert's hand tightly. "We can't keep hiding forever," she whispered. "They're too powerful now, and the curiosity, it's turning to fear." Robert nodded, jaw tight, knowing the fragile barrier of secrecy that had protected their family for years was crumbling. They had thought the world could be kept at bay, but now it was pressing in from every direction. The twins themselves were oblivious to the social unrest outside. They played together, building strange patterns with blocks and whispering in the silent language Margaret had long tried to understand. Yet their awareness of the outsider's curiosity was palpable. The tension in the air affected them too, subtle but unmistakable. They responded instinctively, testing their influence, gently nudging the world around them, aware of eyes watching from the trees and fences. By evening, the atmosphere around the farmhouse had grown almost oppressive. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound sharper. Margaret and Robert realized that hiding was no longer enough. They needed to consider containment, teaching, or even isolation in ways they had never dared to imagine. The twins' abilities were growing, unpredictable, and capable of bending the reality around them in subtle but undeniable ways. That night, Margaret wrote in her journal, the pages trembling slightly under her hands. She documented the events, the growing curiosity and fear of the county, and the ways the twins seemed to sense, anticipate, and respond to human perception. She understood now that secrecy was not enough to protect them, or the community, from what was coming. Next, we discover how the twins' growing power and the county's mounting fear collide, leading to a moment that will force the parishes to make decisions they never thought possible, decisions that will define the fate of Thomas and Sarah. Chapter 14. Choices in the Dark. The parishes had lived in silence for years, carefully shielding Thomas and Sarah from the world outside. But by early 1956, that fragile peace was shattered. The events of the past months, the whispers, the unusual occurrences, and Whitaker's terrifying encounter had made secrecy nearly impossible. Carter County's curiosity had morphed into unease, and unease into fear. The pressure was suffocating. One evening, Margaret sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the twins asleep in the nursery. Robert stood at the window, watching the shadows stretch across the snow-covered fields. "We can't wait any longer," Margaret said softly, her hands trembling. "If someone comes too close, if anyone sees what they're capable of, we'll lose everything. We'll lose them." Robert swallowed hard. He knew she was right. The children had grown beyond the confines of human understanding. Their powers, once subtle, were now undeniable, precise, and frighteningly adaptive. Even the smallest intrusion, an outsider walking too close, a neighbor glancing through a window, could provoke a display they could never contain. That night the family gathered in the nursery. The twins sensed the tension, their unblinking eyes reflecting awareness beyond their years. Margaret spoke gently, but with a gravity they had never experienced. "You are our children, Thomas, Sarah, and we love you. But the world is not ready for you. You must listen. You must stay hidden until we can protect you." The twins tilted their heads, observing her, as if understanding more than she realized. Their presence filled the room, subtle vibrations humming through the floorboards. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. This was more than obedience. It was a negotiation, a recognition that their lives depended on understanding boundaries they could barely enforce. The decision was made. The parish would take drastic measures to protect the children. Windows would be reinforced, doors barred, and any unnecessary visitors turned away. Fields that had once been open and welcoming would be isolated. Every object in the house and barn would be secured to prevent inadvertent displays of power. But most importantly, the family knew they had to teach the twins control, discipline born not of fear, but of necessity. The following weeks were exhausting. Margaret and Robert devised routines and exercises, guiding Thomas and Sarah in subtle ways to refine their abilities. Objects moved only when permitted, shadows remained unmoved unless directed, and sounds, once alarming, were carefully moderated. Slowly, a fragile balance began to form between the twins' power and the family's need for secrecy. Yet the parishes could not ignore the world entirely. Carter County remained a threat, a ticking clock. Rumors had begun to swirl, driven by small glimpses and whispered fears. Margaret knew that any slip could expose the extraordinary children to scrutiny, suspicion, or worse. Their lives now depended entirely on discipline, secrecy, and the hope that no one else would witness the unimaginable. Next, we discover the first time Thomas and Sarah use their abilities deliberately beyond the house, stepping into the world in a way that will forever change the parish's understanding of their children and their own fears. Chapter 15. Crossing the Threshold. By spring of 1956, Thomas and Sarah had grown sharper, more aware, and frighteningly precise in their abilities. Margaret and Robert had worked tirelessly to teach them control, yet the children's curiosity about the outside world remained insatiable. One afternoon, a simple task, a walk to the barn to feed the animals, became a test of boundaries the family had long struggled to enforce. The twins stepped outside, their tiny hands brushing over the frost-speckled grass. The world was larger than the farmhouse, unpredictable, and teeming with stimuli they had never encountered. Margaret followed closely, heart pounding, while Robert trailed behind, eyes scanning the woods and nearby fields for any prying neighbors. As the children approached the barn, Thomas's gaze fell on the fence surrounding the pasture. With a subtle motion, the wood trembled, bending slightly without breaking. Sarah mirrored the gesture, and the animals, horses, goats, chickens, froze, ears perked, eyes wide. Margaret's breath caught. She had never seen such synchronized control beyond the house. A neighbor, Mr. Calloway, happened to pass by on his horse. He slowed, curious. Margaret stepped forward, instinctively trying to shield the twins. But the children had already noticed him. Without touching him, without moving toward him, a subtle pressure seemed to push at his mind. His horse shied violently, almost as if sensing danger, and he stumbled from the saddle, clutching the reins in panic. Margaret and Robert rushed forward, their voices firm but desperate. "Go home, now!" But the twins only watched, tilting their heads, aware of the effect they had wrought. Mr. Calloway fled, stumbling across the frozen ground, terrified and muttering incoherently to himself. The twins returned to Margaret's side as if nothing had happened, innocent once more. But Margaret's hands trembled as she grasped theirs. The incident left the family shaken. Margaret's journal filled with frantic notes, the precision, the instinctive manipulation, the awareness that seemed almost conscious. "They can affect more than objects," she wrote, "even minds and perceptions. We cannot let this happen again." Robert nodded silently, his face pale, the enormity of their secret pressing down with unrelenting weight. The county's curiosity was growing, fueled by scattered rumors of strange occurrences near the parish property. It was no longer whispers and speculation. Now, small glimpses had made it clear that something extraordinary lived behind those curtained windows. Margaret and Robert knew they were running out of time. Every day the twins exercised their powers outside the safety of the house was another day their secret risked exposure. Yet the children remained unaware of the full danger they posed. Their actions were innocent, exploratory, but the consequences were real. Margaret realized with a shiver that the world beyond their home would soon demand a reckoning, and the delicate balance of secrecy, control, and survival could collapse at any moment. Next, we discover the first attempt by outsiders to confront the parish twins directly, a confrontation that will push the family to the brink and test the limits of Thomas and Sarah's control. Chapter 16. The Confrontation. The tension in Carter County had reached a breaking point by the summer of 1956. Rumors of the parish twins had spread beyond whispers, carried along fences, church pews, and marketplace gossip. The small town that had once respected the family's privacy now buzzed with suspicion. It was only a matter of time before someone crossed the threshold, and that day came unexpectedly. Mr. Whitaker, the relentless investigator from before, returned with renewed determination. Unlike the cautious approach he had taken months ago, he now intended to force a confrontation. Armed with a notebook, recorder, and an air of stubborn resolve, he approached the parish farmhouse late in the afternoon. The air was thick, the sun dipping low behind the hills, casting long shadows that seemed almost alive. Margaret spotted him first from the kitchen window. Her heart sank, and she instinctively called Robert to her side. "He's come back," she whispered. "This time, he won't leave without answers." The twins, sensing the rising tension, stood near the nursery window, their small bodies alert, eyes wide and unblinking. There was no fear in their gaze, only awareness. Whitaker knocked. A firm, deliberate knock that carried authority. Margaret opened the door cautiously, trying to maintain composure. "Mr. Whitaker, please, you must leave," she said softly but firmly. He stepped inside anyway, eyes darting around, hands trembling as he adjusted his notebook. "I need to understand what's happening here," he said, voice low but insistent. "I've seen enough to know that something unnatural is at work. I won't be ignored. The twins watched from the doorway, sensing his intent. Margaret felt a chill as the air seemed to thicken around Whitaker. Objects nearby began to tremble subtly, almost imperceptibly. Books, chairs, a small vase on the counter. Thomas tilted his head, focused, and the temperature seemed to drop slightly, a physical pressure pressing on the intruder. Sarah raised a small hand, and the shadows shifted across the room. Whitaker stumbled back, startled. Margaret stepped forward, trembling. "You do not understand what you are dealing with," she said, voice firmer now. "These are children. They are ours, and you must leave." But Whitaker, eyes wide with fascination and fear, advanced again, notebook raised. "I have to record this. I have to document—" Before he could finish, a subtle but undeniable force shifted the room. Chairs swayed, papers lifted into the air, and the shadows seemed to solidify, pressing against him. Whitaker fell to his knees, overwhelmed, heart racing, breath short. He could not explain it, could not comprehend the presence pressing down on him. The twins were not just observing, they were responding, guiding, controlling. Margaret and Robert stood frozen, watching as the man scrambled to his feet and fled, tripping over the threshold, muttering incoherently. The children returned to their usual play, innocent once more. Yet Margaret knew the truth. The confrontation had changed everything. Whitaker would tell someone, or he would return. The family's fragile barrier of secrecy had been tested, and it had barely held. Next, we discover the consequences of this confrontation, the whispers and rumors exploding across Carter County, forcing the parishes to make an impossible choice to protect the twins and the family legacy. Chapter 17. The Choice That Changed Everything. By late summer of 1956, the tension surrounding the parish farmhouse had reached a fever pitch. Carter County's whispers were no longer discreet. Every strange shadow, every flickering light, and every inexplicable occurrence fueled fear and suspicion. Margaret and Robert realized that secrecy alone could no longer protect Thomas and Sarah. The family faced an impossible choice. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, a small crowd of neighbors gathered near the edge of the property, emboldened by curiosity and rumor. Margaret and Robert watched from the window, hearts heavy. They knew that if the twins' abilities were revealed now, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for the family, but for the children themselves. Inside the house, the twins sensed the tension. Thomas and Sarah paused mid-play, eyes wide and alert, their bodies radiating awareness far beyond their years. Margaret approached them gently. "You must listen," she whispered. "You cannot let anyone see tonight, or everything we've protected will be lost." The children tilted their heads, seemingly understanding, their hands resting lightly on each other, as if drawing strength and control from their bond. The crowd outside grew restless, voices murmuring and stepping closer. Robert's hands clenched tightly on the windowsill, his knuckles white. The family had no choice. They had to act decisively. Margaret whispered to the twins, and with subtle gestures, the air around the farmhouse shifted. Objects trembled, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the first unmistakable display of the twins' combined power surged outward. The neighbors froze, terrified by the unexplainable force pressing against them. Chairs toppled, doors slammed, and lights flickered violently. The crowd scattered, running in confusion and fear, leaving the property eerily quiet once more. Margaret and Robert embraced their children, relief and dread tangled together. Thomas and Sarah returned to their usual play, innocent once more. But the family understood the truth. The outside world had witnessed only the smallest fraction of what the twins could do. That night, Margaret wrote in her hidden journal, "The twins were extraordinary, beyond comprehension, and the family's responsibility had grown heavier than ever. They had preserved their secret, but at a cost, the awareness that the world would always lurk, curious, fearful, and perhaps unforgiving. The parishes understood that their lives would forever balance on the delicate line between control and chaos. Carter County would remember the whispers, the strange events, and the fleeting glimpses of what lay behind the farmhouse windows. But no one would ever fully know Thomas and Sarah Parish. The twins had become something other, something that blurred the line between human and unimaginable. And the family had learned that survival demanded not just secrecy, but careful guidance, unwavering vigilance, and a willingness to wield power in silence. As the house settled into darkness, Margaret looked at her children and whispered, "The world may never understand you, but we will protect you, no matter what it costs." The twins turned their gaze toward her, unblinking, aware of the promise, aware of the danger, and aware that their story was only beginning in ways no one could foresee.